Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
There's just one that's not very fun.
This meeting of the Sioux Falls Charter Revision Commission will now come to order. The first item on our agenda this afternoon is the approval of the minutes from our meeting of September 11, 2019. Those were sent out in advance for review. Are there any issues? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Those minutes are so approved. We're now going to move to old business, where we will take up a number of recommendations that were made in the past for amendments to the charter. Today we will discuss two proposals by John Mathias and two proposals by Mr. Joe Kirby. The first item, sub A under old business, formal recommendation number 1 by John Mathias. Plurality voting for city council elections should be instituted. That is, in the estimation of the chair, virtually identical, if not identical, to item B, formal recommendation number 6, to Charter Section 2.02 by Joe Kirby, plurality voting for an election of a member of the City Council. However, we'll take these in order, starting with item A. What I will do, unless there is an objection from any of my fellow commissioners, I will ask for comments from the public on all 4 of items A through D, because in order to make sure the public has a fair and full opportunity to comment on these items before we take our vote on them, we'll do that. So, and then we will turn after that to discussion and debate and possibly questions from the members of the Charter Revision Commission. So beginning with item A, formal recommendation number 1, plurality voting from John Mathias. Are there any comments from the general public on this item? Any comments? Seeing none, we'll turn it over to comments from the commissioners. Questions or comments? Mr. Zylstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to ask some advice from my fellow commissioners who have more experience in the charter revision process in this city than I do. And I want to raise it before we get into the substance of discussing any one item. And that's what screening, what criteria do we use for placing items before the voters? I have myself come up with a few. Obviously, it's important for us to review whether they are valid. Is it legally written? Would this make sense? And we have the city attorney as our advisor to help us with that. Another item that I think is important is probably, is it internally coherent with the rest of the charter? Is it in keeping with the core concepts of the charter? Or does it knock one of the legs out from under our charter so that our charter winds up looking like the zip feed mill in the end? A third thing that I would think would be, but is it significant? Is it sufficiently weighty both to be in the charter and to have a revision of the charter? My guess is one version of all 3 of those is probably been used in the past. But I have a 4th one that puzzles me a little bit, and I've heard different things as I've heard discussions in the past, and that's, do we also apply a screening criterion of wisdom? In other words, do we think this is a good idea? Or maybe to put more bluntly, would we vote for it if we put it on? So are we endorsing these for adoption, or do we believe that they are valid, coherent with the charter, significant to have the voters weigh them, regardless of whether we ourselves might individually or as a group think it's a good idea? And I really need some wisdom from my fellow commissioners on that.
Thank you, Mr. Zylstra. Ms. Politas, Ms. Hayek, comments, response on Mr. Zylstra's question?
Well, since I came on with Mr. Zylstra, I think I'll yield to other members and see, because it would just be my own opinion at this point in time.
Ms. Politas?
When I came on, Mr. Gregerson told me his philosophy, and it was if we felt, it wasn't if we support it, but if we think it should be up for a vote, that we should vote to put it on the ballot. But also keep in mind, like Commissioner Zylstra said, does it fit in with the charter?
I'll offer just a few comments, and they mirror some of the ones that I made at our first meeting. I think it was back on June 19. There are two sections in current municipal law in Sioux Falls that talk about the charter. Revision Commission, the first one is Section 8.01 of the charter itself, which says that one of the ways to amend the charter is by a report of a charter commission created by ordinance, something can be put on the ballot. The City Council has then acted on that authority in the charter and adopted current ordinances 32.1 through 4. And in those sections, particularly 32.2, it lists the duties of the Charter Commission as we may deliver a report to the city election authorities framing and proposing amendments to the city home rule charter that is approved by at least 4 commission members. That is really the limit of what the City Council and the framers of the charter have laid down as the scope of the duties of the commission. So in my mind, it is important that if an issue comes before this body that seems to be a way in which we can keep our charter up to date, we can change our charter to address issues that are important, but as Ms. Politas said, also consistent with the existing charter. Things that would be true improvements to the charter itself, those are things that we should consider, and if the debate and discussion and the information presented is such that it seems like something we as commissioners would propose to be voted on and probably proposed to be adopted by the voters in Sioux Falls, that we should then put it on the ballot. And that is how I voted on the proposals that have come forward since I came on in 2015, 14, one of the two, actually succeeding Mr. Gregerson on this commission. So from that standpoint, the way that we typically handle these is when a recommendation comes forward, there is either a motion to put the item onto the ballot, in other words, as the ordinance says, to propose an amendment to the city home rule charter for vote by the citizens, then that motion will be voted on. In the alternative, a motion could be made to lay on the table, to dispose of, to reject an item. It's a little procedurally clunky, but basically, as I view the ordinances and the charter, unless we affirmatively propose by a vote of at least 4 members of this commission an amendment to the charter, it will not go on the ballot. And will just die at the end of our current cycle in the end of December or January. So with that in mind, is there any discussion about formal recommendation number 1 from Mr. Mathias, plurality voting for city council elections? Ms. Hayek.
Well, I really, really appreciate the form that we have in terms of the recommendations. The charter article section to be revised then is not noted here. So I am under the belief that it would be inserted under section 6.01 elections. Is that correct?
The problem is we've invited Mr. Mathias back repeatedly, basically at every meeting, and asked him to clarify whether or not Mr. Kirby's recommendations would be duplicative for his own and whether he would support those in lieu of his own. Mr. Kirby, under formal recommendation number 6, proposed his plurality amendment to Charter Section 2.02. So I would suspect that's where Mr. Mathias's would need to go as well, but I guess it could go under Article 6.
Well, the reason I ask is that Article 6 is fairly specific in terms of the election will be conducted in accordance with the provisions of state law. And that was the premise that this charter was set up under. And then there's a little bit more specificity under Section C of 2.02. And I am curious, does state law differ from that provision? Does anyone know? Where no council members, it goes, unless a part, no, it doesn't actually direct that either. Is there anything in the charter that states it's different than state law? I mean, that's the whole premise on how we conduct our elections, correct? Either one, yeah.
Greco?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We do provide for elections the way state law does. There's no exceptions really within our charter. We do have a note in there about when nomination petitions are due, but that mirrors state law itself. But generally, the state requires elections on the second Tuesday in April, and a lot of the other provisions that are mentioned in there.
And I, on my own, have tried to do a lot of outside reading on rank file voting and plurality voting and wrap my head around it if I could. So if someone has some expertise in this area, unfortunately, there's no one here to address it that has presented it.
Well, I guess I see you looking at me, Commissioner.
Thank you.
One of the things, I guess I wanted to, if we're talking about item 3A, and really 3A and 3C, and obviously you've invited Mr. Mathias a couple times, and I think the commission may have passed a threshold requirement that the proponent specify the section proposed to be amended. So I don't want to discount or avoid the question, but I think for those, unless the commission decides, certainly I think that's within the bounds of your discretion, but for purposes of analyzing those two, A and C, the fact that he has not availed himself of that rule, I wonder if those are even open to consideration under the rules as they exist.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mr. Zylstra.
Mr. Chairman, in light of the comment of our legal advisor reminding us of our rule that we did adopt, but also in light of the fact that both A and C are duplicative, essentially, substantively anyway, of B and D, whatever motion you wish, but I would say I would move to lay A, formal recommendation 1, on the table, to take no action on it so that we can move to B.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Zylstra. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. It has been moved and seconded that we lay on the table formal recommendation number 1 from Mr. Mathias. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We'll move on to formal recommendation number 6 to Charter Section 2.02 by Joe Kirby, plurality voting for election of a member of the City Council. Again, I would invite any members of the public who would like to come forward and comment for, against, or otherwise on formal recommendation number 6. Ms. Brecky, welcome back.
Thank you. Respectfully, Commissioners, I wasn't planning on testifying, so, and you've heard me speak and you've heard Joe speak, so I'm not going to, we've both given you supportive documentation, for our suggestions. And I would just simply say that the concept there between Dale, Joe, and, we kind of did work together on this. We had different thoughts. It was kind of a package idea with the plurality, the bonding issue, the long-range strategic planning issue, and the removal of the mayor from the council. Those were ideas together that we thought would bring the council more into its role, in a leadership role. And we really saw it all as kind of a checks and balances things, that there's been kind of a shifting, away from the council's, exercising of its policy-setting functions, and that these kind of things would cause a respected relationship to develop between the mayor and council as respected partners by adding a few more responsibilities. So it was kind of a package thing. That's what we were thinking. The plurality, again, I gave you a detailed history of how that change was made, how it's bounced around, how the council members have actually kind of pled that they don't want to deal with it. They don't feel comfortable setting the criteria for their own election. And so I think that, you've got that basis and that foundation. I would, my testimony, of course, is in favor of it. And I would say for Joe, I did happen to run into him last week. I asked him if he was planning on being here, and I feel comfortable telling you he's out of the country. So that's the only reason he's not here. He would be here, but for the fact I think he's in Tokyo today, so he's not here. So I don't want his absence to mean that he's lost interest, because I know that he hasn't. So if you have any questions.
Ms. Brekke, I do have one question. Have there been any votes or motions made by the city council on the plurality voting to try and change back the laws on that threshold?
Yes, there was one earlier this year.
Okay.
And that is the one where, Tom might jump in here if I'm wrong, but at least two of the council members, expressed, real concern about, I think Councilmember Sale and Councilmember Erickson both expressed concern about setting the criteria for their own election, that they were voting the way they were voting, but they just didn't, they felt they were in a lose-lose situation. And I didn't feel that way, because, and again, we were just going back to what had worked successfully, for all those years, 20 plus years. And so I just saw it return to the original way of voting was warranted, and then again laid out for you the way it was kind of put through without a lot of consideration. It's just put through on an amendment to a cleanup ordinance. And so I just thought this was the body to really give it that careful consideration. What is for the future, do we want, to be our standard? So.
Mr. Zylstra, did you have a question? Okay, thank you, Ms. Brekke. Any other public input on formal recommendation number 6? All right, seeing none, we'll turn to questions and discussion from Ms. Hayek.
Could someone very succinctly explain plurality voting for those people listening and for everyone, and myself included, as a refresher?
So, Tom Greco, City Clerk, plurality voting is basically first to the post. So it doesn't matter how many candidates there are in a particular contest. The one with the most votes is the one who wins. So there's no specific limit, just the highest number of votes. Opposed to a majority system or a plurality with a runoff, which is what the city has had for several years, because state law does provide for a simple plurality vote, but it also provides for cities to adopt, municipalities to adopt a runoff provision, and presumably with that runoff provision, they could identify what the threshold is. So that can be anything. For us, it was 34 or 35% from 1998 up until the most recent election.
So may I expound? So my understanding was when this was all set up way back in '94, it really was a plurality vote setup at that point in time. And then in 98, the city council took action to put the runoff in if the party with the most votes didn't have the threshold percentage.
In my understanding, and I've read the minutes from those meetings back in that time, there was not necessarily, I believe state law at the time provided for a majority vote for city council members. So the transition provision in the charter did have a straight plurality vote for council members getting elected to the first seats of the city council. They may have even done it for the next regular election, which was in 1996. In 1998, they ran by a majority system. And so there was, if you recall, there was a runoff between two members, and they both had the highest number of votes, but they didn't have 50%. And then they had another election, and they both got voted in anyway. So in 1998, October-ish, well, September, October, there was an effort to change ordinance, to change it to a plurality. And that was actually the original ordinance proposal, a straight plurality. So first to the post wins. It was by amendment that the 34 or 35% was included. And that's where it originated.
Thank you. Thank you.
Further questions, discussions on formal recommendation number 6? Mr. Zylstra?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm presuming, in the light of what I've heard and no objection having been raised by our legal counsel, that the language as proposed by Mr. Kirby would be valid legal wording. So we can check that one off. It's probably internally coherent with the charter because we've had it sounds like we've had a number of different approaches within the charter. And so that it would work with that. Significance, it hasn't been do I understand correctly? This has never been amended. It's never been in the charter before. It's always been by ordinance, governed by ordinance. So then I do have at least raise an eyebrow as to whether this is weighty enough an issue to be put in the charter. However, I also heard the testimony from Councilor Brecky that at least some on the city council are uncomfortable with adjusting ordinances on election. Obviously it's been done in the past, but currently it seems like some are wondering whether this is indeed something that ought to be settled by charter. So on that score, I would like to hear a little bit more from my fellow commissioners as to whether indeed this is a weighty enough issue to ask the voters to decide it. We've heard the testimony from Councilor Brecky that she and at least some of her colleagues on the council probably think it is. And certainly Mr. Kirby also thought it was, as did Mr. Mathias.
Further discussions? Questions on formal recommendation number 6? I would just offer a couple of comments on this item. You know, the council made this change originally. They put it in an ordinance, and the council can change it back at any time. I understand that our members of the city council feel a certain level of discomfort about that choice, that they'd be controlling their own thresholds for being elected, but that was what happened at the beginning. That was how we got this on the books. To Mr. Zylstra's point, I had in my notes here that the charter up to this point has been completely silent on the threshold of vote necessary to avoid a runoff, to control those decisions. I, as a commissioner, would have a certain level of discomfort recommending to the citizens that they pass this. I think, and I appreciate Ms. Brecky's testimony on this recommendation a couple of times. I would say she was the only current city council member that we've had come forward and offer testimony asking this commission to put something on the ballot. There's a citizen petition going on right now, gathering signatures to make this change, among others, to our city charter. And so if that process moves forward and they're able to collect the requisite number of signatures to go on the ballot, and this goes for all of the items that we'll be discussing that are repeated in that citizen petition. If that happens, then I think the citizens have spoken, and they have decided that they want this issue advanced to the level where we are going to amend what is effectively the charter or the constitution for the city of Sioux Falls, which trumps even our ordinances. So, and you know, in addition, I haven't heard a real groundswell of public opinion asking for this change to the charter to be made over the decisions that were made in the past by the city council. We've heard from Mr. Kirby, whose excellent work on these issues and advice and perspective I have appreciated greatly. But other than that, and Ms. Brecky, we have not heard from very many that this is something that they want the Charter Commission to put on the ballot. So from my standpoint, I think for those reasons I'll be opposing recommending this amendment to go on to the ballot. But I don't want that to just, you know, I think this discussion is helpful, and it's possible that points could come forward that could change my mind on that, so I don't want to forestall any motions or otherwise. Ms. Hayek.
It's an interesting issue because it is really almost impossible to discuss this issue without going into the one that is further on in regard to the language that would adopt ranked choice voting. And I make those comments in that we do not have any limit on the number of candidates that can run for an office, which is great. We get into the legislature, they do their primaries and get it all broken down. So if we have 20 people running and we use plurality, it makes absolutely no sense because we all know that that's got to be fine-tuned down to the right number. And currently, that's what our city council seem to recognize and do and adopt and are currently using. If we were to do the plurality voting as is anticipated with this particular recommendation, then coupled with it, they want to do a ranked choice voting. And that's what I've been studying. Some states have adopted it, some of them have adopted it and now want to change back, but you essentially, whether you want to rate somebody or not, you have to. So there may be 4 candidates and you're okay with 2 of them, the other 2 you don't want at all. Nonetheless, you're going to give them a 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 4, 3, 2, 1, if you will. And what can happen is that you end up giving power in that sense of maybe all the 2s. And I've read a lot on this subject that it's kind of frightening. So I really applaud the individuals that took the step to do the runoff with the plurality. And I think at this point in time, it is working for us. But I do want to say that I don't think we can talk in a vacuum about plurality voting because the ranked choice has to go with it. And so I don't think you get one without the other. And that's the consideration I think that we need to really look at.
Mr. Chair,
Ms. Politis.
I guess I do not see a connection between plurality voting and the necessity of having ranked choice at the same time. I would support having the voters decide on plurality voting, but not including ranked choice at this point. And with that,
And
Ms. Hayek?
clarify why I think that is so important and why they go together, that if we have 20 candidates and we split the vote, you know that the person who has the most votes in straight plurality voting probably isn't the one that people want, because they've split it with 19 other candidates. And so, as Joe Kirby advocated, and he said the plurality and ranked choice go really hand in hand. And that's why I question, you know, it's not an easy topic, I don't believe, but that's why I said that, so.
Well, and my concern about ranked choice voting is the public would really, there has to be some real public education for that to be even put on the ballot.
I'll just make one or two more comments, but I would agree with Ms. Politis. I think that, you know, we've purposely separated these recommendations such that adding the language proposed by Mr. Kirby to the charter on ranked choice voting would not adopt ranked choice voting. It would definitely simply allow for that to happen in the future. So it would allow under the charter the city council to move forward with adopting ranked choice voting if they wanted to. A couple more things. I think when I sit on this commission, the two big questions that I ask are, what is the current problem with the Sioux Falls City Charter as written? And second, how will the proposed amendment to the charter solve that problem? And on that analysis, on the plurality voting issue, I have not heard evidence that there is a serious problem with the way that our charter is currently worded as it impacts plurality voting. I think on that issue, that the council is absolutely in the best position to investigate and weigh the issues like this one. This is a volunteer board which is appointed by the mayor, meets once a month, and while the Sioux Falls, or the city staff, city attorney's office, city clerk's office, finance office, and others have been very generous with taxpayer time to help us research some of these issues, I think it goes without saying that the board of the city, the council itself, has the most time and resources, and we're elected to make the tough decisions like this one. You know, I have not heard evidence that there is a serious problem that's been caused by this decision by the city council to put this change into the ordinances. And therefore, I would defer to that body that if something needs to be done to undo the change, that they should be the ones to do it, not have the Charter Revision Commission propose onto the ballot something undoing what was a decision of an elected political body. And then I have also not heard how inserting this brand new type of language into the charter, proposing that for the ballot, would solve the problems, the couple of problems that we've heard possibly outlined. So with that, Mr. Zylstra.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This discussion is very helpful to me in my decision on how to vote. However, the easiest part in my decision is the fact that at least one or two of my commission members have indicated they're not going to support it, which means all four of us here have to support it or it's not going to move forward. So it's a bit of a freebie at this point in terms of my vote. But I have a bigger concern, and this is going to apply on another issue too. As you've pointed out to us very helpfully, the charter specifies 3 ways that amendments can take place. And we have heard very public word about an effort to place this on the ballot by petition, the very thing we're considering. And that's very valid. If that occurs, then I, as a voter, get to decide which way I want to vote. I am very uncomfortable with us as a commission weighing in on any of those items that are in process. Doesn't mean I won't if my fellow commissioners think it's wise. But it's sort of like we're endorsing what someone else is already in the process of doing to try to get two streams flowing rather than just one amendment stream going. I would probably look far more favorably on this in another year or two after we find out whether the voters have been sufficiently interested to place it on the ballot by petition, and if so, how they voted on it. And so I am not inclined to support it at this point, but as I say, my vote probably is not going to be decisive anyway.
If there's no further discussion, the chair would entertain a motion on formal recommendation number 6. Mr. Zylstra.
I move that we lay it on the table, in which case if, for instance, the whole petition drive announces that they've given up their effort, we might want to look at it again, or we might want to look at it without prejudice in the future year.
I suppose you're making a motion to lay on the table without prejudice?
Right.
Okay. Just for my way of procedure, I would emphasize that if we lay it on the table, then but for the April election of 2020, it would be a dead issue. I think at any point in the future, for members of the public, we would welcome you to come forward with the same proposals if you like, provided it would certainly be helpful if there was more information or new evidence to justify why it should be made. So we have a motion to lay on the table formal recommendation number 6. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. We have a motion and a second to lay formal recommendation number 6 on the table. In other words, take no action and not propose it for the ballot in 2020. Further discussion on the motion.
Mr. Chairman, if I can insert a comment, just as I think through this, and just ensuring that as we make these motions that they're clear as far as what that tabling means, because I'll give you an example for city council meetings, indefinite deferrals are discouraged because you just, it hangs in sort of a limbo status. And if this is, if this is being tabled, I guess that I would ask if that decision means it's going to be taken up yet in 2019 as we look through the rest of this Charter Revision Commission cycle, as opposed to one that's tabled indefinitely, because now you're handing off to a new year and a new commission. And so I guess I would ask for a little clarity in the motion, and arguably even the other one in that respect, because I think it needs to be either one that's actually under active consideration or at some point accepted or declined in effect. So.
As the chair, I think my perspective has been that if we lay it on the table, the previous motion and this one, that it is declined for 2019. However, if it would be helpful for the record, for us to make a motion to decline the matter, that's not, the problem is that's not something that's under Robert's rules, but I have no problem if we want to make a motion to decline a formal recommendation instead of laying it on the table.
If I may jump back in, I guess one of my concerns is just for the public in general, so they know whether, if they want to champion this issue, for example, do they come back and ask the commission to pick this one up off the table, or do they bring a separate? And so I just think that clarity would be helpful, because I'm not sure the tabling is in Robert's rules either. And so,
Mr. Chair, I would appreciate it if we could wait. I would like so that Commissioner Timian could be part of this decision also.
So, Ms. Politis, you're proposing that we defer action on items A, B, C, and D, or just B and D, the ones for Mr. Kirby?
Well, for any definite decision to go ahead with the ballot, I would prefer it that all 5 of us would be here to vote on it.
The problem with doing that is we scheduled this in advance. The agenda was sent out sufficiently in advance for Mr. Timian to be present. And we have to make sure that we get through our full list of formal recommendations, which is at this point is at 12. And I believe we'll probably move on to 13, possibly 14 formal recommendations between now and December. So I do agree it would be optimal to have all of the members of the commission here, but unless there's further objection, I think we do need to move forward with disposing of some of these up or down so that we can get to the rest of them in November and December. Ms. Hayek?
I would agree with that, but I would also like to comment on one of my understandings with the Roberts Rules of Orders that works really much better, it dies for lack of a motion. It is an idea out there, if no one moves a motion on it, it just dies, and then then the public can later bring it back, but probably not in this sequence because we've already moved past that time period. So for further motions or lack thereof, I would suggest that. I don't know if our
The
city
chair is
attorney
fully
agrees.
comfortable with that concept. Is that okay with city attorney's office, or would you view that as a deferral?
Well, a lack of action being a deferral, I guess I'd just put a bug in the ear of our parliamentarian over here on the Roberts Rules component, so I would welcome his input.
I would suggest that some sort of action does need to be taken on it. However, I would just keep in mind that regardless of the action, even if you did decline or even approve it, you always have the option as a body to reconsider an item. So leave it at that.
Okay. So, Mr. Zylstra, you made the motion on formal recommendation number 1. I would invite you to make a new motion, one to decline or accept formal recommendation number 1, which we laid on the table, but we'll take it back up off the table for a definitive action on that one.
My point, Mr. Chairman, and maybe hate to get into the parliamentary issues, but if we get it straight now, maybe it'll be easier on future subjects. I want to do it without prejudice.
To Mr. Greco's point, under Robert's Rules of Order, if we decline to decline a formal recommendation, we would have the option during the next cycle of the Charter Revision Commission to have some member of the public come forward and make an identical proposal or some modified version of the same proposal. So they would have that opportunity. In addition, we as the body could vote to reconsider a prior vote. So if someone comes forward at our December meeting with brand new information that wows this commission and makes us change our mind one way or the other, we would have the power to reconsider our prior action. But at least this way we would take definitive action.
Then that way that is how I would word mine, that we decline action.
All right?
And if I may interject, just in the interest of expediting things here a little bit, A and C, I believe, are, correct me if I'm wrong, as we've discussed those, and considering the rule established by this commission, those would be declined on procedural bases. So, and you can make the motions to that regard, but there's a rules issue there. For B and D, then I think you're looking more at the substantive acceptance or declination, which would be without prejudice because it's not a bar to future proposals along the same lines. So,
Mr. Zylstra?
That's fine.
Okay, motion just on formal recommendation 1, or do you want to make a motion as well on recommendation number 3?
I'm sorry, I got lost here.
Formal recommendations 1 and 3.
Oh, I thought we had already moved to 2. Okay, recommendation 1, I would invite the chair to rule that out of order. I'd raise the point of order whether it is in order, in keeping with the committee's rules.
We agreed as a commission to take an up or down vote on every formal recommendation that comes forward. So I would say ruling it out of order is not taking formal action. Ms. Hayek?
Mr. Chair, if I may make a substitute motion on item A, that we would reject it because it did not comply with the regulations that we had set forth in this committee.
Okay, we have a motion.
Support.
Second by Mr. Zylstra. Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of rejecting formal recommendation 1, please vote aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Moving on to formal recommendation number 6, plurality voting, Charter Section 2.02 from Joe Kirby. Is there a motion to accept, decline, or otherwise formal recommendation 6? Mr. Zylstra.
This one, I will make the motion to decline to take action.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to decline formal recommendation number 6. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion to decline that recommendation, please vote aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Formal recommendation number 3, item C, by Mr. Mathias. The incurring of significant debt by the city, such as multi-million-dollar bonding, should require a supermajority of the city council. Is there public input on formal recommendation number 3? Ms. Brecky.
Again, since I spoke to you before, I'll be brief, but Tom, did you have extra copies of these or not? I'll just pass it around and put it into the record. I had Tom do this at the very last minute, and I was thinking as we were discussing this issue that it would be interesting to know what the voting history was on bonds. And so I gave him very little notice. I thank him so much for doing it. But for what it's worth, I just think it's valuable information for this kind of a discussion. Is it usually 8-0? Is it, a breakup? What's the split? What's the breakdown? So he didn't really have time to do any kind of analysis, but I think it's just useful to look at, and I'll just, again, offer it as part of the record.
Mr. Chair, may I interject at this point in time? I know there has been some discussion. I was forwarded, blogger feels that because my husband is an attorney who has done bond work for the city, I should not participate in this discussion. And there was some erroneous information sent that my husband works for a bonding company. He does not. So if the committee would like me to step away from the table and not participate in this, I will do whatever you feel is right. So there you go.
Ms. Hayek, I, as the chair, would defer to you and leave that decision to your judgment. I think we have a quorum with 3 members of the commission. If you would like to step away, you're welcome to, but I'll leave that to your judgment.
I will then just move back from the table and not be part of the discussion.
Okay, let the record reflect that Ms. Hayek will not be participating in the discussion of, correct me if I'm wrong, formal recommendations 3 and 8.
For purposes of clarity, is it safe to say you're recusing yourself from those? Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry that I only have one copy. I would like to pass it around. I think what it would generally show is the vast majority of the time.
Ms. Brecky, do you want to put it on the overhead?
Oh, there you go. Again, with just kind of a fast, it's not really been
Yep.
analyzed, but if you just run down it, it would show that the vast majority of the time you do have either a supermajority or more than a supermajority that, vote approving the bonds. And if you have any questions, Tom can answer the questions because he put it together. But I think I would offer that in support of the amendment because it's not going to change things so much of what's happened in the past, but I think it kind of seals it for the future that is an extremely important function, of our government, of the council's responsibilities. And I would just mention that other places where there's a supermajority are similar in that there's, equal importance. When the city engages in condemnation, that's when you're taking people's property away, requires a supermajority. When you're engaging in vacation, that's when you're giving the public right away back to the public, back to the individuals that are bordering the property. That takes a supermajority. When you override a veto, that's, important that, again, that for the council to override the mayor's function, that takes a supermajority. I do think this rises, to that level of importance. And I don't think that it really changes anything, but it does cement that that's important, a very important function for the council. And it is, virtually millions and millions of dollars, that we do in those, when we pass those bonds. So to require a supermajority for the future, I think just, makes good sense.
Thank you, Ms. Braggie. I would note, for purposes of formal recommendation number 3 by Mr. Mathias, this suffers from the same 2 procedural problems under our rules that formal recommendation 1 suffered from, and that would be that no copy of the proposed amendment to the charter was offered in advance, and there's no reference to a specific section of the charter that would be amended to make this change. With that in mind, questions, discussion, comments on formal recommendation number 3? Seeing none, is there a motion on that recommendation? Mr. Zylstra.
Move to decline action on the grounds stated by the chair.
There's been a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that formal recommendation number 3 be declined. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to decline formal recommendation number 3, please vote aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Formal recommendation number 3 is declined. Moving on to item D under old business, formal recommendation number 8 to Charter Section 2.11 by Joe Kirby. Require a vote of at least 6 members of the City Council to issue any bonds.
Mr. Chair, I would also recuse myself on this matter.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, and on that note, just in the interest of consistency, yeah, okay. Generally with city council meetings, if a city councilor recuses themselves, that they just step out of the room and that we can come get you. They just usually I think they step through there, and there's a little waiting room, right? Yeah, I think Jim.
Just
that one.
get in your car, drive home. No. Just
It's
kidding.
dark in there, Jim. There are lights.
Let the record reflect that Ms. Hayek has left the dais and has recused herself from action on this. Public comments on formal recommendation number 8. Ms. Brecky, I will allow you time to comment on this, but I would assume that your comments on the last recommendation were meant for this one.
That's my only purpose for coming up. That was my intent. I was getting ahead of myself.
Quite all right. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, can I ask Councilor Brecky a question? In the city charter, there is another exception to the majority rule that requires 5 votes.
It's of an ordinance?
In the charter, it requires 5 votes, I believe, to accept a bid, an excessive bid, or I don't remember the exact terminology. It's in the same section. My question is, why did you go with the super duper majority of 75% rather than being consistent there with another aspect of the charter that asks for a supermajority of 5 votes?
The answer to that is, in the bid situation, that's more, at that point, you're more administering. I mean, when you're actually accepting the bid, basically you're just approving the thing on a go-forward basis. When you're actually voting on the bond, I mean, you're actually approving the funding, the actual funding mechanism itself, and you're actually approving that multi-million-dollar deal, as opposed to just executing it by approving a bid.
This question would be either for the city attorney's office, possibly for Ms. Brecky. I guess my question is, and I'll just preface this by saying I think the answer is that the city council can do this. But whether the city council by ordinance or procedural rule may set the vote threshold for issuing bonds, or whether the city council alternatively under Charter Section 8.01 could propose an amendment to the charter under Section 2.11 like Mr. Kirby has recommended. I don't find anything in the charter currently, and I don't know of any ordinances currently in existence that would prohibit the city council from adopting an ordinance or even a procedural rule by which it says we have to get a supermajority of our members in order to adopt any bonds. Ms. Brecky.
I'll take a crack at it. Just clarification, you're saying, do I think that they could do
Yes.
it by ordinance? Nowhere in any of these supermajorities that I've referred to is it done by ordinance. It's either state law or in the charter itself. You know, it would be worthy of research, so I'm kind of jumping out there, but I think that that is something that has to be done by charter or state law.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Koistra, Mr. Greco, does the city council?
And my rationale for that would be because you are actually affecting the powers of an elected official. You know, if I'm an elected official, you know, I have certain responsibilities that I have just because I have that election certificate. And for the council to tinker with those actual, those fundamental powers that you have by limiting your vote or, you know, doing things with your vote, I think that's got to come from a higher power, not from the council itself.
Mr. Koistra, Mr. Greco,
Which would mean the charter or state law.
Does the city council currently have any procedural rules that govern votes like that, or the way that its processes work from that standpoint? No? Okay. Okay, Mr. Zylstra.
Ma'am, I don't know if this is an inquiry, but it strikes me that the charter says under 2.11C, all actions of the council shall be by a majority of those present, except, and therefore I would strike me that the charter does tie the hands of the council. All council decisions are by majority vote, except where the charter specifies an exception. So I think if this is, my reading of this would be that it will have to be a change in the charter if that were to become the policy.
Okay.
I think there's another place in there where it requires specifically, it has to be by 5 or ordinances have to have a 5 vote. So in other words, you can't pass an
Right.
ordinance with less than 5, you know, even if you.
That sentence goes on to read, except no ordinance or action calling for expenditure of money in excess of the state bids.
So it does appear that the chart, when those exceptions are made, it's coming out of the charter or state law.
Okay. Thank you. Good answer, Mr. Zylstra. Thank you. Further public input? Seeing none, we'll turn to commissioners for questions, comments, discussion on formal recommendation number 8. I'll just offer this thought on formal recommendation 8. Talking to some of those who are working right now with the city petition, the citizen petition to make this same change to the charter, and hearing the presentations that have been made to the commission so far this fall. The reason why this one is being brought forward revolves around a couple of very definite, specific decisions that have been made by the city council in cooperation with, and a vote of the mayor sitting as a member of the city council in the last couple of years. There were specific examples given of projects, bonds issued, votes taken, with which a group of people in the city of Sioux Falls, many of whom are working with the petition circulators, to issue those bonds, to take those votes. And there was disagreement in that group with those specific votes. Again, I think that those were political decisions made by an elected body which had a wealth of information, debate, and discussion brought before it They are beholden to their voters, their constituents around the city of Sioux Falls. The way that our representative democracy works, all the way down to Sioux Falls, South Dakota municipal government, is that if you disagree with a political decision, you vote those people out of office the next time, and it's possible that they can undo the decisions that were made by the prior elected officials, undo those political decisions. Again, this body, the Charter Revision Commission, is a non-political body which is appointed, meets once a month at most, does not have the kind of time and resources or constituent response, duties and obligations of our elected officials. So I have a serious concern with, based on political disagreement and political decisions, with amending our charter to prohibit those same kinds of decisions or make them more difficult in the future. I haven't heard any examples that go back more than the last few years of egregious problems with the way our charter has been functioning since 1995. And I don't think that I have heard arguments which would cause me to recommend that this go on the ballot or to agree with this change. Again, I would hesitate to make those kinds of political decisions based on disagreements. And I offer no comments on whether or not the decisions that were made were the right ones or not. But you will hear probably some same comments that I will make on a couple of the other formal recommendations that have been made. So that's where I come down, and I think, whatever motion is made, I think I'm going to resist putting this one on the ballot as a formal recommendation. And to Mr. Zylstra's earlier point, we have a citizen petition circulating right now, and if a sufficient number of citizens come forward and sign that, then I think they've spoken, and they have said, we want the opportunity to vote on this. Further discussion? Questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman, I would, I can't suggest the lack of a quorum, but I would suggest the lack of a sufficient number of commissioners present to place this on the ballot. And so I don't know exactly where we go from here.
I think that we have a quorum, but without 4 people to vote in favor of it, I think that it would be declined automatically. So if someone is going to make a motion to defer action on this item to a future meeting, I think regardless, Ms. Hayek will still be recused from voting on or discussing this recommendation, then that's fine. I'll entertain that motion, but I think the answer is pretty clear. Any motion? Seeing none, procedurally, I'm going to defer to Mr. Greco to tell us if this is just something where we're going to have to dig deep and someone's going to have to make a motion, or if it's going to die under Robert's rules for lack of any action.
That's kind of a tough question. I hate to say it, but I would defer to the body. An option is to perhaps defer it to a different meeting or, take some type of action. But you're correct, obviously, in that there's a quorum present and that it's been noticed. But
Mr. Chairman,
Zylstra.
I would therefore move to defer definitely. I think that's the word on our sheet of motions to the next meeting. When hopefully we will have 4 people who would be eligible to vote on it. That being said, I'm not trying to duck the fact that I am not inclined to support this for primarily the reason you spoke. I don't think the charter should be restructured because of disagreements with with legally taken political decisions. And the other concern I really do have is, in keeping with the charter, which provides considerable flexibility for moving forward with the city and has served well in that regard, the extra supermajority, the 75% majority, I believe, becomes problematic in terms of the general spirit of the charter. However, I do think we ought to have at least the possibility of this being put on, so I'm going to move that we defer it definitely to the next meeting.
I second.
Okay, it's been moved by Mr. Zylstra, seconded by Ms. Politis, that we defer action until our next meeting, November 6th, to a later, to that meeting, formal recommendation number 8. Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed? Nay. Motion carries. Item E under old business. Application of City Ordinances 32-1, 32-4, and the consideration of adoption of a rule. This is the issue we discussed previously on the city attorney being a non-voting ex officio member of the Charter Revision Commission. Mr. Zylstra, I'll let you talk to this one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will try to make this brief. I do want to emphasize the fact that, I will withhold my comments until Commissioner Hayek rejoins us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just call everyone's attention to the fact that under 32004, it specifies that the city attorney is a member of the commission and its legal advisor, and I think that is probably the root of the question of what does that mean in terms of voting on this board, on this commission, pardon me. Subsequent to our discussions, all of us on this commission have received a notification from Mr. Neitzert, City Councilor of the Northwest District, that it is his intention to bring to the City Council an amendment to that ordinance that will remove any reference to the city attorney as being a member of the commission and simply clarify that the city attorney serves as legal advisor to the commission. In my mind, that solves the issue. It clarifies everything, and so I would withdraw my concerns and would withdraw any motion I intended to make under E.
All right, thank you, Mr. Zylstra. I think that disposes of item E under old business. Moving on to item F, list of formal recommendations for revision to the Sioux Falls Charter. If you'll turn to that in the materials. At this time, based on our action up to this point today, we have disposed of recommendations 1, 3, and 6 on the list of formal recommendations. We need to set our agenda items for the next meeting. It is the chair's recommendation that at the next meeting, we plan to take up items 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. That would leave at this time items 9, 11, and 12 for our meeting in December, as well as any items that may be presented newly at the November meeting on the 6th. Ms. Hayek.
Mr. Chair, in light of the requirements that we have had in regard to the charter article section to be amended, 3 of the items that we have listed for next month's agenda, we do not comply at this point in time. And is it my understanding that there is still that opportunity to have the proposer comply? And if not, we'll take action.
Yes, two reasons I would say we need to set those for discussion at the November meeting. First, yes, the chair and this body have offered the public, Mr. Mathias included, every opportunity to come forward with specific language and specific charter sections that they are proposing to amend. And two, because we have not formally set those, giving the requisite notice that we're going to be considering and voting on them. So I would say that we need to take those up at our November meeting. Any objection to recommendations 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10 being taken up at our November 6th meeting? Ms. Hayek. Okay. With that in mind, that'll be our plan going forward. New business, anything to consider? Seeing none, we'll turn to public input of any kind. Ms. Brecky.
Commissioners, thank you. That was the first time I'd seen the proposed ordinance by Greg Neitzer, and I was present when you had the discussion about the role of the ex officio role of the city attorney for this particular committee. And I can't tell you right now how I feel about it. I'm still kind of rattling around because this is the first time I've seen it. But I can give you a little bit of history about why that was done, because that is the only committee, I believe that's the only committee that the city attorney this is the only committee the city attorney serves in that capacity. It was a non-voting capacity. And the purpose of that was the idea that the city attorney needed to be more than an advisor. They needed to be able to be assertive in the manner of giving you research into the background and history of the amendments that were being proposed to you without being asked. And so a lot of the research, for example, that I gave of you traditionally back when that committee was started, the stuff from National League of Cities, that would have been stuff as soon as a proposal came in, the city attorney's office would have just went back and collected up all that information for you and just given you packets of information on any proposal that was brought to you, just background and history from resources like the National League of Cities, from legal resources like Wright and Miller, to kind of educate you on the process. But they didn't vote, but they were allowed to do that independently, to allow them to be more participatory in that process so that you could make truly informed decisions, without just relying on the testimony that was come before you. So that was kind of why it was, I can't really tell you why it was done, but that's how it was implemented back then. So I don't know if that background helps. And again, I don't know that I'm going to be for or against this. I just need to think about it. I don't really have a strong feeling one way or another. I mean, the city attorney can still do that, but the point of that was to encourage that.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Brecky.
Could
Further-
I ask
Ms.
Ms.
Gosser.
Brecky a quick question, or I guess this is more a comment? Regardless of how the city council revises the ordinance, if it does, please specify that it is without vote, if that is your intention, because it is not currently in the ordinance. And as far as I think either the city attorney or I could find in our research, while the other members are listed as ex officio on various boards and commissions, they all specify without vote, except for this one. So at least resolve that issue.
That's a very good point, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was handled that way, but you're right, it didn't say that anywhere.
Further public input? Seeing none, we will turn to the next item on the agenda. Open discussion on the commission. Are there comments from any of the commissioners? All right, seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of adjournment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Thank you, we are adjourned.